The rain had been falling for hours, a steady downpour that turned the training grounds into rivers of mud and cold mist. The camp was alive with noise, boots striking the ground, orders barked, and rifles firing blanks in repetitive bursts. Soldiers pushed through their drills with the rhythm of machines, hardened men and women whose uniforms were stained with sweat and grime. At the edge of the field stood Claire, a nurse assigned to the regiment not for combat but for care, her role to patch up twisted ankles, bruised ribs, and the occasional real wound that came from accidents in training. She was small compared to the towering frames of the recruits, her white medic's armband a bright contrast against the dull green of her jacket. The soldiers noticed her standing there, clutching her bag, watching them with a look of quiet focus. They had seen her before, of course. She was the one who showed up after someone passed out from exhaustion, the one who carried smelling salts and clean bandages, who soothed complaints with calm efficiency. To them she was harmless, delicate, someone who belonged in the infirmary and not in the grid of their world. And so, when she stood by the rifle rack at the end of the drill, observing the line of gleaming weapons, a few of them chuckled. One leaned toward his companion and muttered something crude about how the nurse wouldn't know which end of a gun fired. Laughter rippled through the group, low and mocking. Claire heard them but said nothing. She had grown used to the dismissive smiles, the way they saw her as background, necessary but forgettable. Still, something in her eyes flickered as she studied the rifle resting in its cradle. It wasn't amusement or annoyance, it was calculation, as though some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment. The commanding officer, Major Harlan, called a halt to the drill. "All right, you dogs, break it down," he ordered, his voice carrying over the wet field. "We'll run the marksmanship assessment after chow." The soldiers groaned, already knowing the routine. They would line up, take their rifles and prove who could hit the target and who couldn't. Bragging rights were currency in the camp, and the competition was always fierce. As the men and women shuffled toward the racks, Claire remained where she was, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. One of the soldiers, a broad-shouldered corporal named Jansen, noticed her lingering and smirked. "What's the matter, nurse? You want to give it a try? Maybe patch up the target afterward." His friends laughed, the sound loud enough to carry. Another added, she'd be lucky to even hold it straight. Probably bruise her shoulder from the recoil. Their derision was casual, almost automatic, the way soldiers often covered insecurity with humor. But Claire did not blush, nor did she step back. Instead, she moved forward, her hand brushing against the cold metal of the rifle as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. She looked at Jansen, her expression unreadable, and said evenly, "Maybe I will." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence. The idea seemed absurd. A nurse picking up a military rifle? It was a joke that wasn't supposed to turn real. Yet here she was, sliding her medic's bag from her shoulder and setting it carefully on the ground. The soldiers exchanged glances, some amused, others intrigued. Major Harlan arched an eyebrow but didn't intervene. Perhaps he wanted to see what would happen, or perhaps he believed the attempt would prove the futility of her choice. Claire lifted the weapon, her fingers steady as they found the grip and trigger guard. She checked the chamber with practiced ease, ignoring the whispers that rose around her. Her stance shifted naturally, shoulders squaring, feet grounding themselves in the mud. For those who knew nothing of her past, it was surprising. For Claire, it was muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. "Targets that way, nurse," Jansen said mockingly, pointing toward the distant row of practice dummies. Claire said nothing. She raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and drew in a long, slow breath. The rain slicked her hair to her cheeks, but her eyes were unwavering, locked onto the bullseye. The moment stretched, silence gripping the field. Then came the shot. The crack of the rifle echoed across the training ground, sharp and absolute. When the smoke cleared, the soldiers saw the distant target jerk with impact. A clean hit, dead center. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hiss of rain. Jansen's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening as if refusing to believe what his eyes told him. Another soldier murmured, "No way." Claire calmly lowered the rifle, her expression unchanging, as though the result had been inevitable. She didn't look at the others, didn't search for their approval. Instead, she reloaded, raised the rifle again and fired. Another shot, another perfect hit. Then another and another, each one striking the center with unerring precision. The targets bore the evidence, holes clustered tightly where only the most skilled marksman could manage. The soldiers' disbelief shifted to awe, their laughter silenced completely. Major Harlan's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, though he quickly concealed it beneath his stern exterior. Claire finally lowered the rifle, her breathing calm and controlled. She wiped a raindrop from her brow and glanced at the stunned group. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I may not wear your uniform," she said, "but don't assume that means I don't know what I'm capable of." The words struck harder than the bullets, piercing through the arrogance that had filled the air only minutes before. For the first time, the soldiers looked at her not as the fragile medic who bandaged their wounds, but as someone who carried power of her own. Jansen shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of her performance. No one laughed now. The rain continued to fall, mingling with the smoke and the silence, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the shift in balance. Claire placed the rifle back on the rack, lifted her medic's bag and walked away, leaving behind a group of soldiers who would never underestimate her again. The silence that followed Claire's display lingered long after she left the field, hanging over the camp like smoke from a fire that no one could put out. The soldiers dispersed eventually, muttering to one another in low tones, replaying the sight of the nurse firing with such precision. It was as if the world had turned upside down for them, the roles they thought were fixed now blurred and unsettled. In the mess hall later that evening, their laughter had not returned. Instead, conversations hushed whenever she passed, eyes darting to her with a mixture of respect and unease. She sat alone at a table in the corner, eating with quiet composure, ignoring the weight of their stares. What they did not know was that her hands shook slightly under the table, not from fear or weakness but from memory. She had not picked up a rifle in years, not since the days before she wore the armband of a medic. There had been another life, one buried deep, when Claire was not just a caretaker but a fighter, trained with the same rigor as those who now mocked her. That part of her had been locked away, pushed into the shadows of her mind where it could not intrude on the role she had chosen for herself. But today, provoked by laughter, it had surfaced like a ghost refusing to stay buried. Across the hall, Jansen and his friends sat clustered at a table, their voices hushed and tense. "She got lucky," one of them insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. Jansen scowled, pushing his tray aside. "Luck doesn't put every round dead center. I don't know what she is, but she's not just a nurse." Their conversation was overheard by Lieutenant Markson, who raised an eyebrow and leaned in. "The Major knows," he said flatly. "He let her do it. Didn't stop her. That should tell you something." The words unsettled Jansen more than he cared to admit. He had spent years earning his reputation as one of the better shots in the unit, but in the space of minutes she had eclipsed it effortlessly, and worse, she had done it without even trying to gloat. It gnawed at him, that calm confidence, that indifference to whether they believed in her or not. Later that night, Claire sat in the dim light of the infirmary, cataloging supplies, her mind drifting despite her best efforts. Bandages, antiseptic, morphine, all lined neatly ready for the inevitable scrapes and injuries of soldiers pushing themselves too far. Her role was to heal, to restore, not to destroy. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of the rifle, the steady pull of the trigger, the recoil absorbed by her body as if it had always belonged there. She pressed her palms against the desk, steadying her breath. She had left that life behind for a reason. She had sworn not to return. But the laughter, the way they had dismissed her, it had been more than mockery. It was a reminder of how fragile respect was in a place like this, how easily one could be forgotten or dismissed. She had never sought their approval, but she could not allow them to mistake compassion for weakness. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the camp soaked and quiet, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Major Harlan walked through the stillness with his usual steady stride, his mind on the day's events. He had known Claire's record when she was assigned to his regiment, though few others did. Her file was thick with commendations, training scores, and a history of service that spoke of someone far more dangerous than the gentle medic she presented herself as. She had chosen this path, but the instincts she carried could never truly vanish. He paused outside the infirmary, watching through the window as she worked. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her movements were precise and deliberate. He had seen many soldiers struggle to reconcile the person they once were with the person they wanted to become. Claire was different. She had mastered both, though at a cost only she could measure. The following morning brought new drills, harsher than before, as the major drove the soldiers harder, pushing them toward their breaking points. Claire was on the sidelines again, tending to strained muscles and bruised egos. But now no one looked at her the same way. Their eyes carried an edge of wariness, a grudging respect that none dared put into words. Jansen avoided her gaze entirely, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed the way her presence unsettled him. At midday, the regiment was ordered into a live-fire exercise in the training grounds, simulating combat in rough terrain. The soldiers geared up, their rifles gleaming, their packs heavy with supplies. Claire followed with her medical kit, prepared for the inevitable injuries. She moved quietly among them, listening to their chatter, noting the shift in tone. Where once they would have joked and boasted, now there was an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't the exercise they feared, it was the nurse walking silently among them, the memory of her flawless shots still echoing in their minds. The drill began with smoke bombs and loud bursts from mounted guns, creating a chaotic battlefield. The soldiers advanced through mud and tangled brush, shouting commands, taking cover, firing at targets that appeared suddenly in the haze. Claire moved behind them, her eyes scanning, her hands ready. When one soldier slipped and twisted his ankle, she was there in seconds, steadying him, binding the injury with swift precision before sending him hobbling back to the safe zone. Her hands were gentle, efficient, her voice calm and reassuring. Yet when she picked up the soldier's dropped rifle to clear it from the mud, those who saw her froze, watching with bated breath. She didn't fire, didn't even raise it. She simply checked the chamber, flicked the safety on, and set it aside with the ease of someone who knew the weapon inside and out. The small act was enough to reignite their unease. They could no longer separate the nurse from the marksman. By the end of the drill, the regiment was exhausted, their uniforms soaked in sweat and mud. Claire worked tirelessly in the aftermath, tending to every scrape and wound, her demeanor professional, her presence steady. The soldiers thanked her awkwardly, their voices carrying new weight. No one laughed anymore. But that night, as the camp settled into uneasy quiet, Jansen sat alone, staring at his rifle with clenched fists. Pride burned in him, stoked by humiliation. He could not stand the idea that the nurse had outshone him. He swore under his breath that he would prove himself again, that he would find a way to reclaim his place. What he didn't know was that the opportunity was closer than anyone expected, and when it came, the truth about Claire would stun them all even more than before. The next day dawned under a pale sky, the clouds stretched thin as though even the heavens were holding their breath. The camp buzzed with routine, soldiers moving through drills and duties, but beneath the surface there was a current of tension, a shift in the way everyone carried themselves. Claire walked among them with her medical satchel as she always did, but where once there had been smirks and dismissive jokes, now there was silence and stolen glances. Respect was growing, but it was tangled with something else, something sharper: unease. For Jansen, the unease had hardened into determination. He could not let the nurse's quiet demonstration overshadow his years of work, his identity as one of the best shots in the unit. Pride was not just vanity for him, it was survival, the thing that drove him to push through pain and exhaustion. In his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, he made a silent promise to himself. He would challenge her, force her into a situation where he could prove once and for all that skill belonged to the soldiers, not to someone who patched up their wounds. But Claire was not concerned with Jansen's pride. She had her own battle inside her, one she fought in silence. The rifle in her hands had awakened memories she had fought for years to bury. She remembered the deserts of another posting, the crack of real gunfire not aimed at targets but at enemies whose faces she never forgot. She remembered the nights when sleep was impossible because the screams of the battlefield echoed louder than the silence of her quarters. That was why she had chosen to hang up her rifle, why she had taken the medic's oath. It was easier to heal than to destroy, easier to live with saving lives than ending them. Yet yesterday when she had pulled the trigger, there had been no hesitation. Her hands had remembered everything. That truth unsettled her as much as it unsettled the soldiers. Later in the week, Major Harlan announced a competition, one designed to test the regiment's overall performance in combat simulation. It would be a full-day exercise across rough terrain, blending endurance, marksmanship, and teamwork. The announcement electrified the camp. Soldiers thrived on competition, on the chance to prove themselves. Bets were whispered, rivalries flared, and Jansen's eyes lit with grim determination. This was his chance, he thought. If he could dominate the competition, the shadow of Claire's performance would finally be erased. What no one expected was what the major said next. This time, Harlan declared, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group, the medic joins you. Shock rippled through the soldiers like a wave. Claire stood at the edge of the formation, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. She did not volunteer, nor did she refuse. The decision had been made above her, and she knew Harlan well enough to understand his reasoning. He wanted to test them, not her but them. He wanted to see how they would react to the presence of someone they had underestimated, someone who forced them to confront their own prejudices. She'll run with you, she'll shoot with you, and she'll carry her own weight, Harlan continued. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken knowledge that refusal was not an option. Jansen clenched his fists, anger burning in his chest, but he kept his mouth shut. If anything, this would give him exactly what he wanted: the chance to prove her weak in front of everyone. The day of the competition arrived with a blaze of sun that burned away the morning chill. The soldiers lined up, rifles slung over their shoulders, packs weighed down with supplies. Claire stood among them, her uniform plain, her medic's armband still visible but no longer a symbol of fragility. She carried her pack without complaint, her rifle resting against her shoulder as naturally as if it had never left her side. The whistle blew and they were off, pounding across muddy trails and steep inclines, the course designed to punish the body and test the will. Sweat ran down faces, breaths came in ragged gasps, and the sun showed no mercy. Claire ran in silence, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. Some soldiers surged ahead, desperate to prove their dominance, while others lagged, struggling under the weight of their gear. At the first shooting station, targets popped up at varying distances, challenging the soldiers to hit them quickly and accurately. Jansen stepped forward with his usual swagger, his shots sharp and precise. He hit the bullseyes cleanly, his confidence swelling as murmurs of approval rippled around him. When Claire's turn came, the air grew thick with anticipation. She set her rifle, inhaled deeply, and fired. The shots rang out like drumbeats, each one slamming into the center with clinical precision. The group fell silent again, their awe renewed, their doubts crushed further. Claire lowered the rifle with the same calm composure, neither smug nor surprised. She simply moved on. The competition pressed forward, dragging them through rivers waist-deep, up rocky hills, and into thick forests where hidden targets lurked like ghosts. Claire carried her load without complaint, helping a younger recruit haul herself out of the mud when she stumbled, binding another soldier's bleeding hand without breaking stride. She was tireless, her strength quiet, her focus unshakable. The soldiers who had once mocked her now began to draw strength from her presence, watching the way she endured without faltering. For Jansen it was infuriating. Every time he thought she would slow, she did not. Every time he thought she would miss, she struck true. His own performance was strong, but beside hers it felt diminished, overshadowed by the ease with which she seemed to excel. The final leg of the competition pushed them into a mock combat zone, smoke grenades filling the air, targets appearing suddenly as they crawled through trenches and sprinted across open fields. It was chaos, the kind designed to simulate the madness of real battle. Adrenaline surged through every soldier, their muscles screaming with exhaustion but their minds sharpened by the need to win. In the midst of it, one soldier tripped badly, twisting his knee with a sharp cry. The others pressed on, focused on finishing, but Claire stopped without hesitation. She dropped beside him, her hands working quickly to stabilize the injury. She tore strips from her own sleeve to bind his leg, her movements efficient even as shouts echoed all around them. Once she was sure he could be moved, she hauled his arm over her shoulders and half-carried, half-dragged him through the chaos toward the finish. The sight of it struck the others hard. They had fought only for themselves, desperate to prove their worth, but she carried another without hesitation, sacrificing her own chance to win. When they crossed the finish line, both of them covered in sweat and dirt, the camp erupted into cheers, not for the fastest, not for the sharpest shooter, but for the nurse who had carried her comrade across the line. Jansen finished minutes later, his pride shattered, his face dark with bitterness. The soldiers who had once laughed with him now clapped Claire on the back, their eyes shining with respect. In that moment she had become something more than a medic, something more than a ghost of her past. She was both healer and warrior, the embodiment of everything they aspired to be. And Jansen knew, with a sinking weight in his chest, that nothing he did could undo what she had proven. That night the camp was alive with a different kind of energy, not the rowdy laughter of men bragging about drills or mocking the weaker recruits, but a quieter, more thoughtful hum that spread through the tents and barracks like a current no one could resist. Claire had become the center of whispers, though she never sought the attention. Soldiers spoke in low voices of the way she had carried her comrade across the finish line, of how her shots had struck with precision none of them could deny, of the strange strength in her that defied every label they had placed upon her before. Some admired her openly, others begrudgingly, but none could ignore her any more. Claire, however, felt no triumph as she sat alone in the dimly lit infirmary, cleaning the grime from her uniform and binding a scrape on her arm. Her thoughts wandered back to years past, to missions she had sworn never to remember. She could see them clearly, the desert sun burning over shattered buildings, the sharp scent of gunpowder, the look in the eyes of the men she had faced down the barrel of her rifle. She had tried to bury that woman, the one who could kill without hesitation, under the kindness of a healer. Yet here she was again, summoned back by laughter, by doubt, by the need to prove herself. She sighed softly and pressed a hand to her face, whispering to herself, "I never wanted this." Outside the infirmary, Jansen paced like a restless wolf. His pride had been cut deep, and though he tried to mask it in front of the others, his frustration gnawed at him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her carrying that soldier, saw the cheers that should have been for him but were for her. It was intolerable. He wanted to expose her, to show the others she wasn't untouchable. More than that, he wanted to prove it to himself. His chance came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, Major Harlan summoned Claire to his office. She stood before his desk, her posture steady though her eyes betrayed the weariness she carried. The major studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't tell them," he said at last. Claire didn't pretend to misunderstand. "They didn't need to know." Harlan leaned back, folding his hands. "Perhaps. But sooner or later the past has a way of catching up. They'll find out, one way or another." She met his gaze, her voice firm. "I'm not that person anymore. I chose to be here to heal." The major's eyes softened briefly, then hardened again. "Maybe. But don't think the battlefield cares about your choices. When the time comes, you'll have to decide whether you're the nurse who patches wounds or the soldier who stops them from happening." Claire said nothing, her silence answer enough. She left the office with her heart heavier than before. Rumors began to spread within the camp, whispers of classified files and old missions, the kind of stories that grew in the dark when truth was scarce. Jansen fanned those whispers quietly, hinting to others that she was more than she appeared, that her skill didn't come from nowhere. He fed their curiosity with fragments, pushing them toward doubt. At the same time, he trained harder than ever, determined to beat her at any cost. Then came the mission that changed everything. A supply convoy had gone missing in the hills north of the camp, ambushed by raiders who had grown bold in the chaos of the borderlands. The regiment was dispatched to track them, recover what they could, and neutralize the threat. It was meant to be routine, but everyone knew routine missions were the ones that went wrong fastest. Claire was ordered to accompany them, her presence as medic essential, though many wondered if the major had another reason for bringing her along. They set out at dawn, the terrain rugged and unforgiving, their boots crunching over loose rock and dry earth. The sun climbed high, beating down on them as they advanced cautiously through the hills. The tracks of the convoy were easy to follow, burned-out vehicles, scattered supplies, and bloodstains marking the ground like warnings. Claire moved silently among them, her eyes sharp, her pack heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the tension tightening with each step, the knowledge that enemies watched from the ridges above. When the ambush came, it was sudden and brutal. Gunfire erupted from the rocks, echoing like thunder, bullets sparking against the ground as the soldiers dove for cover. Smoke and dust filled the air, shouts rising over the chaos. The regiment returned fire, but the raiders were skilled, striking from elevated positions with deadly accuracy. Claire dropped behind a shattered boulder, dragging a wounded soldier with her, her hands already working to stem the bleeding. Her heart pounded, but her movements were steady, precise. Another soldier fell nearby, and she crawled through the dirt to reach him, ignoring the bullets snapping past her head. She was a medic, she reminded herself, here to heal, not to fight. But when the raiders pushed closer, when the line threatened to break, something inside her shifted. She grabbed the rifle from the fallen soldier's hands and swung it up with practiced ease. Her shots cracked out cleanly, dropping 2 raiders from their perches before the others even realized she was firing. The regiment stared in shock, but there was no time to dwell on it. She moved with them, firing when she had to, tending wounds when she could, weaving between the roles of healer and warrior as though she had never left either behind. The battle dragged on, fierce and merciless, until at last the raiders broke and scattered into the hills. The soldiers regrouped, battered and bloodied but alive, their supplies recovered. And standing among them, rifle still in her hands, was the nurse they had once laughed at. No one mocked her now. They had seen what she was capable of when lives were on the line, and it humbled them. Jansen said nothing, though his eyes burned with conflicted fire. He could not deny what he had seen, nor could he accept it. Claire, meanwhile, felt the old weight pressing on her chest, the burden of the woman she had tried so hard to bury. She had fought again, and she had not hesitated. The cheers of her comrades rang hollow in her ears, for she knew the truth. Every time she picked up the rifle, she stepped further away from the peace she had fought so hard to find. The camp's atmosphere shifted after the drill, but with it came a dangerous undercurrent that Helen could not ignore because admiration had a way of twisting into rivalry, envy, And sometimes open hostility in a place where pride was currency and soldiers measured worth not by kindness or healing hands but by their ability to command fear and respect on the battlefield. And though many of them had started to see Helen with fresh eyes, there were still those who could not stand that a nurse had outshined them with their own weapon. And so whispers started to stir in the barracks, low voices muttering when they thought she couldn't hear, suggesting that her success was a fluke, that maybe someone had adjusted the sights for her or that she had simply gotten lucky. And Helen felt those whispers gnaw at her. Even though she tried to appear calm because she knew that no matter what she did, there would always be those unwilling to accept her worth, but what kept her steady was the quiet support she found in a handful of soldiers who had seen her up close and recognized that her strength was real, and among them was Corporal Jameson, a grizzled veteran with scars etched across his face and a voice roughened by years of barking orders, who began to stop by the infirmary not because he needed medical care but because he wanted to talk, and during those conversations he told her that the army had a way of crushing those who dared to stand apart, but that she should never let them grind her down, for soldiers respected consistency above all else, and if she proved herself again and again, their laughter would never return. Helen took his words to heart, and when the next opportunity came she seized it because the colonel, perhaps sensing the changing winds of morale, decided to hold a series of competitive exercises between squads, with prizes awarded for precision, teamwork and endurance. And though nurses were not meant to participate, Helen found herself invited, perhaps as a test or perhaps as a spectacle. But either way she refused to back down, because she understood that every moment was a chance to redefine how they saw her, and she knew she would never forgive herself if she let fear hold her back. The first exercise was an obstacle course, a twisting nightmare of walls, mud pits, barbed wire, and rope climbs designed to leave even the fittest soldier gasping for air, and as the men lined up, many of them looked at her with amusement, some even offering half-mocking encouragement, calling out that she should be careful not to break a nail, but Helen ignored them, her jaw set, her heart steady, and when the whistle blew, she threw herself forward with a determination that shocked them. Because though she lacked their bulk and brute strength, she possessed endurance born from long nights with little sleep, endless days running from one patient to another, and the quiet resilience that came from lifting the weight of others' suffering, and by the time she reached the rope climb, her arms screamed with fatigue, but she thought of every soldier she had pulled back from the edge of death, and she hauled herself upward with a raw cry, pulling herself over the top and running toward the finish line. She did not finish first, but she did not finish last either, and the stunned silence that followed her completion of the course said more than any cheer could have, for she had once again shattered the fragile boundary between who they thought she was and who she had become. The second competition was marksmanship, and here Helen knew she had the chance to silence every doubter once and for all, because luck could perhaps be blamed for one good shot, but not for consistency across multiple targets, and as she stepped to the firing line she felt the familiar weight of the rifle settle against her shoulder like an extension of her own body, the noise of the camp fading until all that existed was the steel sights and the distant silhouettes waiting for her bullet, and she breathed in, exhaled, and fired with a calm precision that came not from arrogance but from trust in herself, each shot punching a hole into the paper where she willed it to go, and by the time she lowered the weapon, there was no argument left, because the tally showed she had placed second overall, beaten only by a sniper who had been shooting since before she even joined the medical corps, and this time when the men looked at her, there was no laughter, only respect laced with a new kind of unease, as if they had to reconcile the idea that someone they had dismissed as fragile could be more dangerous than half of them in the field. But the test that changed everything came last, an endurance march with packs weighing nearly half her body weight, a brutal trek across uneven ground meant to weed out weakness, and here Helen nearly broke, because no amount of training as a nurse could have prepared her for the searing agony of carrying that much weight mile after mile, her shoulders rubbed raw, her lungs burning, but every step became a vow, every stumble a reminder of why she was doing this, and when she finally crossed the finish line, staggering but unbroken, she collapsed to her knees, tears of exhaustion streaming down her face, and it was in that moment that something shifted, because one by one, soldiers who had once mocked her extended their hands, pulling her to her feet, clapping her on the back, murmuring words of respect not born of pity but of genuine acknowledgement, and she realized that for the first time since she had come to the camp, she was no longer just the nurse to them, she was one of them. Yet even as camaraderie began to form, Helen could not shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible line, that by proving herself she had entered a dangerous space where expectations would only rise, and where enemies might become bolder in their resentment. And as the evening fire crackled and men laughed and shared stories of the day, Helen sat quietly with her hands folded, knowing deep down that the real battle had only just begun. the days after the competitions passed with a strange blend of calm and tension, because although Helen had earned respect, she had also unsettled the order that held the camp together, and in a place where rank and tradition were the spine of discipline, any disruption could lead to cracks that spread quickly, and Helen began to notice the signs, the way some men stepped aside for her now with subtle nods of acknowledgement, while others whispered more venomously than before, their pride bruised by her victories, and among them was Sergeant Cole, a man with a hard jaw and eyes like flint, who had always prided himself on being the strongest in his unit, and though he had never directly confronted her, Helen could see the simmering anger in his clenched fists and hear it in the sharpness of his orders when she passed, and she knew without a doubt that he would not let her newfound place go unchallenged. The test came one night during a sudden alert when the alarm bell shattered the silence of the camp, jolting everyone awake, because scouts reported movement in the valley, signs of a possible ambush, and within minutes soldiers scrambled into formation, rifles at the ready, adrenaline surging as the colonel ordered squads to fan out and secure the perimeter, and though Helen was not required to go with them, she grabbed her medical satchel and followed because if there were going to be casualties, she would not sit in the safety of the tents while others bled in the dark. The night was thick with tension, the kind that pressed on the chest and sharpened every sound, the crunch of boots on gravel, the low murmur of radio calls, the distant howl of wind across barren ridges, and Helen felt her pulse hammering as she moved among the men, her eyes scanning not only for danger but also for the first sign of someone in need of her aid. And then it happened, gunfire splitting the silence, bright flashes tearing across the darkness, the crack of bullets snapping through the air as enemy fire erupted from the ridge. Chaos followed, shouts rising, soldiers diving for cover, and Helen dropped low, her hands clutching her satchel, her mind racing through every medical scenario she might face. But before she could even reach a wounded man, something primal stirred in her, an instinct born not from training but from the raw knowledge that survival required more than bandages in that moment, and her eyes fell on a rifle lying next to a fallen private, still loaded, still ready, and without hesitation she seized it, pressing the stock into her shoulder, her breath steadying despite the storm around her. She saw figures on the ridge, shadows darting between rocks, muzzle flashes marking their positions, and she fired, one shot, then another, not wild but controlled, each bullet finding its mark, and in the chaos she became more than a healer, she became a shield, her presence turning the tide as her accuracy pinned the attackers and bought precious time for the squad to regroup. Sergeant Cole was nearby, and when he saw her firing with the precision of a seasoned marksman, his eyes widened with something caught between disbelief and rage, because in that moment she had taken from him the one thing he believed untouchable, the authority of strength in battle, and though the firefight ended within minutes as the attackers melted back into the darkness, leaving only silence and smoke behind, Helen knew something had changed forever. When the men gathered after the skirmish, breathing hard, sweat and dust streaking their faces, the colonel himself walked to her, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment the entire camp seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would be reprimanded for stepping outside her role or praised for saving lives, and then with a curt nod he said only, "Well done, nurse. You stood your ground," before turning to issue new orders, but that single phrase carried more weight than a medal, for it was the first time he had publicly acknowledged her as more than the woman tending wounds in the shadows. The soldiers murmured among themselves, some clapping her shoulder, others avoiding her eyes, but Helen could feel the division growing sharper, like a blade being honed, and though victory tasted sweet in her mouth, it was chased by the bitterness of knowing she had painted a target on her back, because men like Cole would not let her triumph go unanswered. That night in her tent she sat awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring at the dim lantern light, her hands still trembling faintly from the memory of recoil, and she asked herself if she had crossed a line she could never step back from, because she had sworn an oath to heal, not to kill, and yet when the moment came she had pulled the trigger without hesitation. And she wondered if saving lives by taking others would make her stronger or slowly unravel the part of her that made her who she was. Still, she could not deny the truth that echoed in her chest. If she had not acted, more of her men would have died, and sometimes healing was not only about bandages and medicine but about standing between life and death with whatever tools you had. By dawn she had made peace with her choice, though unease lingered, and when she walked into the mess hall the next morning, conversations hushed as eyes turned toward her, some filled with respect, others with resentment, and in the far corner Sergeant Cole sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on her like a predator watching prey, and Helen knew then that the next confrontation would not come on the battlefield but within the camp itself, where proving her worth would require not only skill but also the courage to stand unbroken in the face of those who wished to see her fall. The days that followed the ambush stretched into a tense silence that wrapped itself around the camp like a suffocating fog, because though the enemy had been driven back, the true battle now lay within the boundaries of their own walls, where suspicion, pride, and wounded egos simmered beneath the surface, and Helen, though she carried herself with calm determination, could feel the shift every time she entered a room, the way voices would lower just enough for her to know they had been speaking of her, the way laughter would carry a sharp edge when her back was turned, and most of all the way Sergeant Cole's eyes followed her with the cold calculation of a man plotting his next move. Helen did not flinch, because she understood that every step she took had to be deliberate, every word chosen carefully, for one wrong slip could undo everything she had worked to prove, and though she told herself she would not let their resentment pierce her, she could not ignore the way her heart quickened whenever she caught sight of Cole looming in the mess hall or barking drills on the field, his voice louder than necessary as if reminding everyone of the authority he still held. Then came the day when the colonel announced a joint training exercise between squads, a simulated raid designed to test strategy, coordination, and leadership under pressure, and though Helen was not required to participate, the colonel singled her out with a gaze that left no room for refusal, assigning her to Cole's squad as if to test whether she could survive under his command or perhaps to see if Cole himself could set aside his grudges. The squad gathered at the edge of the training grounds, their packs loaded with blanks, smoke grenades, and rubber knives for close combat, and Helen could feel the unease radiating from the men, some shooting her uncertain looks as if wondering whether she would be an asset or a liability, while Cole stood before them with his arms folded, his expression carved from stone, his voice dripping with disdain as he gave the briefing, making it clear without saying her name that he did not trust her presence among them. The exercise began with the whistle's sharp cry, and the squad moved into the mock battlefield of ruined buildings, tangled fences, and trenches filled with mud, the air filled with the crack of blank rounds and the shouts of rival squads, and Helen kept low, moving carefully, clutching her weapon though she prayed she would not have to use it, because this was meant to be training, not survival, but her instincts sharpened all the same, every shadow and sound pulling her deeper into focus. Cole barked orders, deliberately harsh, sending her to scout ahead where the risk of being tagged out was highest, and Helen knew it was a calculated move meant to humiliate her, but instead of hesitating she pushed forward, sliding through the dirt, crawling beneath fences, her ears tuned to the smallest sound, and when she spotted the rival squad lying in wait near a derelict bunker, she signaled the danger with sharp hand gestures just as she had seen soldiers do, and her warning aloud. Her squad to ambush the ambushers, catching them off guard and securing the objective. For a brief moment triumph flickered in the men's eyes, but Cole's jaw tightened as if her success was an insult rather than a victory, and Helen realized then that no matter what she did, he would never allow her to stand without attempting to tear her down. The exercise dragged on, brutal in its demands, and Helen's muscles screamed as she carried her pack, dove into trenches and scrambled over walls, sweat pouring down her face, dirt caked on her uniform, but with every obstacle she cleared, she felt herself growing stronger, her will hardening like steel forged in fire, and when the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the exercise, their squad emerged battered but victorious, having secured more objectives than any other, and though the men cheered, Cole's silence was louder than their voices. His eyes locked on Helen with the promise of a reckoning. That reckoning came sooner than she expected, because that evening as the men gathered in the mess hall, Cole stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and called her out in front of everyone, his voice booming as he accused her of overstepping her place, of seeking glory that did not belong to her, and of disrupting the chain of command by making herself more important than the men she was meant to serve. And though the room fell into stunned silence, Helen rose slowly, her hands steady, her gaze fixed on his with a calm fierceness that silenced even the whispers. She did not shout back, did not match his fury with her own, but instead spoke with quiet conviction, telling him that she had never sought glory, only survival, that every act she had taken was not for her pride but for the lives of the soldiers she had sworn to heal, and that if he found her presence disruptive, it was only because he could not accept that strength came in many forms, and for a moment the hall held its breath as her words cut through the thick tension like a blade. Cole's fists clenched, his face dark with rage, but he could not strike her, not with the colonel watching from the corner, his eyes sharp with interest, and though Cole sat back down with a growl, Helen knew the war between them was far from over, yet she also knew that she had stood her ground in front of every soldier, refusing to shrink, and in doing so she had claimed something more powerful than their respect. She had claimed her right to belong, not as a nurse on the sidelines but as a force they could no longer ignore. That night, lying in her tent with exhaustion weighing on her body, Helen thought of how far she had come from the woman they once mocked, and though she felt fear of what was to come, she also felt a rising fire inside her, a fire that whispered she was no longer defined by their laughter or their doubt, but by her own unyielding will, and as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Helen closed her eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring new battles, not all fought with rifles, but all demanding the same courage she had discovered within herself. The final test of Helen's strength came not in drills or staged exercises but in the raw chaos of war itself, because the enemy struck before dawn on a day that had begun like any other, their assault sudden and brutal, shells screaming through the sky, explosions ripping the ground apart, tents shredded into flames as the camp shuddered under the fury of a real battle, and in the first moments of terror Helen could feel the ground tremble beneath her boots, the air filled with smoke and the cries of men caught off guard, yet even as fear gripped her chest she moved without hesitation, grabbing her satchel and a rifle, her instincts no longer at war but working as one, healer and fighter fused into a single force determined not to let this camp fall. Soldiers scrambled to man their defenses, bullets cutting through the dawn haze, and Helen darted between them, dragging the wounded to cover, her hands soaked in blood as she pressed bandages against torn flesh. But when the line began to falter she set her satchel aside and seized her weapon, climbing to a sandbag wall where she fired into the advancing enemy with a deadly calm, her shots precise, her posture steady, and for those who saw her there was no longer doubt, no longer laughter, for in that storm she stood as solid as any warrior, her presence rallying men who moments before had been breaking. Sergeant Cole was there too, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, his body moving with the brutal strength of a man who lived for war, and when his squad became pinned by fire near the eastern flank, it was Helen who broke through the smoke, sliding beside them, laying down cover fire with such accuracy that they could retreat and regroup, and though Cole's pride burned like an open wound, even he could not deny that she had saved them. The battle raged for hours, wave after wave slamming against their defenses, and Helen felt her body breaking under the weight of exhaustion, her arms trembling from recoil, her throat raw from shouting, but every time she faltered she thought of the men who had once mocked her, of the laughter that had stung her pride, and she swore she would never again let them see her bow, and so she fought on, dragging herself through smoke and fire, stitching wounds with trembling hands, then lifting her rifle once more to carve open a path for survival. At one point she found herself in the heart of the fight, cut off with only 2 privates by her side, enemy soldiers closing in through the haze, and it was there that Helen revealed the true steel of her will, dropping one opponent with a clean shot, disarming another with the butt of her rifle, and then turning to shield the young men behind her as she barked orders like a seasoned sergeant, her voice carrying authority born not of rank but of sheer necessity, and the privates obeyed without hesitation, following her lead as if they had done so for years, because in that moment there was no difference between nurse and soldier, there was only survival, and she had become the anchor holding them together. When at last reinforcements arrived and the enemy began to retreat, leaving behind their dead and the smoldering wreckage of their assault, the camp was left in silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of fire, and in that silence Helen stood with her weapon lowered, her body trembling, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes burning with exhaustion but unbroken, and the men who had once laughed at her now looked at her with awe, because she had not only fought beside them, she had led, she had healed, she had carried them through the storm. The colonel himself approached her, his uniform torn, his expression hard but his voice carrying a rare note of respect, telling her that she had done more for the spirit of the camp than any medal or speech could have, and though army rules would never officially recognize her as a combatant, she had proven herself in a way that no regulation could contain, and the soldiers who had once scoffed at her now rose to their feet, battered and bruised, saluting her with a sincerity that needed no words. Sergeant Cole lingered at the edge of the crowd, his jaw clenched, his pride still smoldering, but even he could not deny the truth of what he had seen, and when his eyes met hers, for the first time there was no challenge, only reluctant acknowledgement, the faintest nod of a man who had been forced to see beyond his own arrogance. That night, as the camp worked to rebuild, Helen sat by the fire, her satchel beside her, her rifle leaning against a log, and she thought of the long road that had brought her here, from the days when laughter chased her in the mess hall to this moment when silence and respect followed her instead, and though she knew more battles would come, more tests of her spirit, she also knew she had crossed a line that could never be erased, because she had proven not only to them but to herself that she was more than the role assigned to her, more than the healer hidden in the shadows. She was a force forged in fire, unyielding and unbroken. And so, as the stars spread across the night sky above the battered camp, Helen allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not of arrogance but of quiet triumph, for she had taken their laughter, their doubt and their scorn, and she had turned it into a strength they could no longer deny, and though tomorrow would bring its own trials, tonight she sat knowing that the soldiers would never again laugh at the nurse without remembering the day she picked up the rifle and stunned them all. The end.